Good morning, guys. Brianna and I are really sorry that we can't be here today, but we know that we've left you in good hands, and we're looking forward to seeing you guys again when we get back from our training with Avant. You're going to notice that I'm looking down a lot as I'm kind of giving this little mini lesson because I have my notes spread out over here and making sure I stick to the point. But before we begin, I want to remind everybody about March 30th. That is our volunteer day at the church. Right after church, meals provided. We want you guys to come and be a part of that. The second thing that I wanted to tell you guys about is in April. I'll get you the exact date next week. We are having another round of our discipleship for the church as a whole, going through discipleship with a pastor. It's called Equip, helping us know what is it that we as a church believe, the essentials of our faith. And we really encourage you guys to go to this. I know there's been a couple of you who have attended in the past, and we encourage the rest of you, please come to this. You are the church. You're not separate from it. You are the church. And it's really important that you go through this as well. So with that being said, let's go ahead. We're going to dive into the lesson for today, which is John chapter 6, verses 1 through 24. I'm going to give you a quick overview, and then I'm going to give you a pause so that you as the class can actually read this out loud together. So just an overview of what you're going to be looking at. Today you're going to be looking at Jesus' next two miracles and signs as they're recorded by John. These include the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the water. These are actually some of my favorite parts of the book of John, and we'll discuss why in a little bit. But I'm going to let you guys pause right now, and you get to read this together. All right, now that you've had a chance to actually read through this, we're going to go through and talk about each one miracle at a time. We'll start with a recap and then kind of what are some of the important details in there. So the first one we're looking at is the feeding of the 5,000. This is actually one of only 3 miracles that is recorded in every single gospel: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each gospel records various miracles, but this is one of only 3 that is recorded by each one of the gospels. If you want to know where you can find it in the other gospels, because it's always good to cross-reference and see what they say, in Matthew, you find it in Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 36. You find it in Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 56, and Luke chapter 9, verses 10 through 17. So what we find in this story is that Jesus and his disciples are gathered in Galilee, close to the Sea of Galilee. And many people come to see Jesus. They are attracted to him and want to come and hear from him. They know that he performs miracles, so they are coming to him, and a crowd gathers around. We find out in this story that there are 5,000 people at minimum. That's just counting the men. There may be way more than just that. But what we see is that these people are hungry. And so Jesus asks his disciples, hey, how are we going to feed these people? Now, if you look in the books of Matthew and Mark, we find that Jesus is driven to do this by compassion. It says that he had compassion on these people. Compassion, so we kind of have a working understanding of what that means. Compassion is mercy and love that drives us to action. It drives us to act on someone else's behalf. So Jesus is driven by compassion. That's a really important note for us to hold on to. So Jesus asks his disciples, how are you going to feed them? And Philip tells him, look, it would take half a year's wage for us to be able to buy enough food for each person to just have a bite, not even talking about satisfying them, not even talking about filling them, but just to have a bite. Then Andrew, Peter's brother, comes to Jesus and he says, look, what we do have is there's a boy here who has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, but I don't know how this is going to make an impact, is essentially what he's saying. Well, Jesus takes what this boy has. The boy gives it over, and Jesus takes what this boy has. And he tells everyone to sit down, and Jesus gives thanks to God for what they have, and then he breaks it and starts dividing it and passes it out to each person. And his disciples are the ones passing it out. Jesus multiplies the fish and the loaves of bread to the point of where every single person who is there has not only enough to bite, but each person receives all that they desire. The other gospels say they were all satisfied. I don't know about you, but just a bite of food does not satisfy me. I'm a person, sometimes I have to eat a lot, and then I'm satisfied. But every single person was satisfied. And that's an important thing. At the very end of it all, the disciples all gather up what is left over. And there is an abundance left over. From these 5 loaves and 2 fish, there's an abundance left over, so much so that 12 baskets are collected of the leftover bread and fish. 1 basket for each of Jesus' 12 disciples. So here are some details that I want us to see in this. Obviously, we see Jesus had the power to multiply this. He was able to provide. I mean, this shows, this was something as the disciples gathered the rest of the baskets and see how much is left over. It's a point of Jesus helping build their faith in what he can do. It was a sign to the people of one of the miracles that give testimony and witness to the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. But a couple of details that I love about the story that I want us to get is, I want us to think about the boy in this. The 5 loaves and the 2 fish came from this boy that was among them. The boy gave what he had to Jesus, and Jesus did the rest. The boy gave what he had, and God did the rest. He multiplied it to the point that everyone was satisfied. But I want us to understand, the boy didn't just give what he had. The boy gave everything he had. He gave everything, his own lunch. He gave all that he had to Jesus for Jesus to do with it as he wanted. The boy didn't have the guarantee. He didn't know that he was going to get any back. He didn't know what Jesus was going to do with it. But he gave all that he had, not just some, but all that he had to Jesus. And this was a step of faith. As I said, there's no guarantee that there's going to be something left for him. No guarantee that's going to feed all the people. And even if it did, there wasn't a guarantee that there was going to be enough left over for him. But the boy gave all that he had. And God turned it into something better. Everyone was satisfied, even the boy himself. But he had to give it up first for Jesus to do this miracle with it. So this is a question, this is something that really impacted me as I was studying this, and just kind of an introspective part. And I'm going to kind of wrap up each miracle with a self-evaluation question, a rhetorical one I want you to ask yourself right now, and then you'll come back to it later on in your small groups. So here's kind of my introspective question that I want to ask you. What do you have a hard time trusting God with? Is it your money? Is it a friendship or multiple friendships? Is it sports? Is it habits that you have, or a relationship with the boy or girl? Are you afraid to give it to him because you're afraid of what he will do? Are you afraid to give it to him because you're afraid that that means you have to give it up? I'll be honest, there are things in my life that I am challenged and sometimes scared to turn over to the Lord, because I'm like, well, God, if I give this to you, I may not have this anymore. But what we learn from this story is that God is able to multiply what we hand over to him. What we give up and turn over to him, he makes better. What are you holding on to? We see in the story what God does and what he can do with what we turn over to him. The real question boils down to, do you trust him? With your money, do you trust him that if you give your money to him, he will multiply and use it for the good of others and also still provide what you need, just as the boy did? Is it your friendships? Are you afraid? Do you have friendships that are not good for you? Or do you have friendships that you idolize and put above the Lord? Are you scared to turn that over to him and give it up for him? Or do you trust that if you turn it over to him, that he is able to, and he can, and he will bless you with even better friendships than that one? Same question about a relationship that you're in, or even your time, whatever it may be. Do you trust God enough to turn it over to him and let him make something better out of it? Trust his character and trust his compassion. Remember, at the very beginning of this all, Jesus was led by compassion for these people. Trust in God's character. Trust in his compassion. What are you afraid to give up? What is God challenging you to give up? Trust that when you turn it over to him, he's going to make it something better for you and for others. Now we're going to move on to the second miracle that we see is performed. It wasn't performed in front of a huge group of people. It was performed just in front of his disciples. So we see that after Jesus has fed the 5,000, he steals himself away to be alone and to pray. and his disciples head out on the Sea of Galilee to go to the other side. And we find that as they are on the water, a storm comes along and it makes it difficult for them while they're in the water. I don't know if any of you have ever been on a boat when the water gets choppy. I have, and it makes you sick, and it's a little bit scary because you're out in the middle of the ocean or the middle of the lake, wherever it may be. This is what's happened to to his disciples. So his disciples are battling a storm, and then Jesus comes walking on the water. Now, this story, while not recorded in all four Gospels, is recorded in three of them, in Matthew, Mark, and the book of John. And you'll notice if you go back and read it, those same references I gave you before with the last miracle, each author kind of gives a different emphasis about it. In the book of Matthew, when it's talking about Jesus walking on the water, we find out in that one that Peter also walked on the water, that Peter calls out to Jesus and says, "Lord, if it is really you, tell me to come out on the water." And so Jesus calls him out, and Peter starts walking on the water to Jesus. Now, in Matthew's account, Peter then gets terrified by the winds and waves, and he ends up sinking into the water. But Jesus immediately grabs him, pulls him out, and they get back in the boat, and the storm is calmed. In Mark's account of it, he doesn't include the detail about Peter getting out and walking on the water. Mark focuses on the fact that when Jesus gets into the boat with them, after they're terrified, and he tells them, no, it is I, it's me, it's Jesus. He then gets in the boat with them, and the storm calms immediately. But what Mark points to is the fact that the disciples were confused because they didn't understand the lesson about the bread, which points back to the previous miracle, which we'll kind of discuss that in a moment. In both Matthew and Mark's account, the storm is calmed. But in John's account, we see that John doesn't focus on that part. See, Jesus comes walking on the water, and he calls out to them, and he says, "Don't be afraid. It's me." Or some translations, "It is I." Then Jesus gets in the boat, and it says that the boat makes it to where they are going. One of the things that I think is really interesting here, each gospel writer will put their own emphasis. They have their own purpose, why they wrote their gospel account to the churches, and an area of focus. What is it specifically, that they are focusing on? Whereas Matthew is looking to the faith of Peter in that part, while Mark was looking to the lack of understanding of the disciples. They had just seen Jesus perform this miracle where he shows that he is the provider, that he cares for us, that he takes care of us. The disciples basically forgot that when they got into the boat. That was Mark's emphasis. John's emphasis here, though, is pointing to who Jesus is, that he is the Son of God. Remember, we've talked about this theme all the way through it. But the thing I think is interesting is that in John's account, he doesn't mention that when Jesus got in the boat, the storm was calmed. He simply says, my translation says in verse 21, "Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading." There's nothing mentioned about the storm being calmed in here, which I think this has to deal with the historical context of when John was written. Historical context, what was going on the day and time whenever the book of John was written, the gospel that was sent out to the churches and to the believers to be read, is that there was a severe persecution that was taking place on Christians under the reigns of either Nero, or I think his name is pronounced either Domitian or Domitian. But they were emperors of Rome, and they poured out a huge persecution on Christians of beatings, imprisonment, of murder, of killings. And so during this time, the church is undergoing severe persecution under Roman rule. John writes his gospel to these people, and it's almost as if in this part, John is assuring us, even if the storm doesn't stop, even if the storm isn't calmed, Jesus is still with us, and we will make it through. John's emphasis is the fact that Jesus claims, "It is me, it is I." He gets in the boat and they make it to where they're going. Though the storm was not calmed, they still made it to their destination because Jesus was with them. So this is kind of the introspective questions I want you to think about right now. First question, what is your storm right now? Physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, what is your storm right now? The other gospel writers reveal to us that Jesus calmed the storm. If he can calm a physical storm, he can calm the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual storms that you are facing too. But looking at John's gospel, you have the promise of Christ's presence with you. You will make it through because Christ Jesus is with you. My second introspective question is, what lesson is Christ teaching you now? Going back to what happened in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus had been trying to teach the disciples a specific lesson when he fed the 5,000 to show them to have faith and to trust in him, show them that he is able to provide, that he is the one who takes care of his people. He has the power over creation, over things. He was able to multiply something that is impossible to multiply. But the disciples lost sight of that. There's a lesson Jesus was teaching because he knew what was coming next. So my question is, what lesson is Christ teaching you now? What is he teaching? What lesson is he teaching you so that you have it for when the storm comes, for when you face the storm? And my second question to tag along with that is, where are your eyes fixed now? Our hope is only in Jesus. Just like we talked about last week, all scripture points to Jesus. He's the center of it all. Your hope, my hope, in the midst of these storms are on Jesus. It is in Jesus. So where are your eyes fixed? All right, the final wrap up I want to give before you guys split into your small groups, guys with Patrick, girls, high school girls with Megan, junior high girls with Kayla, is this. What was John's purpose in writing this? Why did he include these miracles in his writing? Remember, John's purpose in writing his gospel was so that we would believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing we would have eternal life. See, in this, John is giving evidence to the fact that Jesus is the real deal, that he really is the Son of God. Only the Creator can control the creation. He walked on the water. Only the Creator, the one who created that, would be able to do that. Only God can make something out of nothing. He multiplied the bread and the fish, which is impossible. Only God can do these things. He's pointing to the fact that Jesus has the power and the authority to save. So respond to him. Believe in him. And if you already believe, live for him and live in him, not in your own strength, but in the strength of Jesus Christ day by day. Respond to him, believe in him, live for and in him. All right, go to your small groups.